In the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's genius saved the Allies from certain disaster. But just 3 months earlier, arrogance and military inertia had led to the greatest air defeat in history. This is the story of how hubris led the Allies into a frozen hell in the Ardennes, forcing Dwight Eisenhower to bet everything on Patton's madness. Victory felt inevitable in the late summer of 1944, as the Allied armies raced across France following the total collapse of the German 7th Army at the Falaise Pocket. Every commander in the field felt the war would be over by Christmas, yet this intoxicating optimism blinded the Allied high command to the logistical nightmare simmering beneath the surface. General Dwight Eisenhower stood at the center of a storm of clashing personalities, attempting to manage a coalition that was as fragile as it was powerful. On one side stood the flamboyant and aggressive General George Patton, whose Third Army was tearing through the French countryside with a speed that defied traditional military doctrine. On the other side stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, whose methodical and cautious approach often clashed with the American desire for a rapid, decisive blow. The friction between these two men was not merely a matter of style, but a fundamental disagreement over how to end the war. Patton believed in a broad front strategy, pushing the Germans everywhere until they broke, while Montgomery insisted on a single, concentrated thrust in the north to seize the Ruhr industrial heartland. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point as the armies moved further from the Normandy beaches, and every gallon of gasoline became a political weapon in the hands of the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice because he could not fuel both Patton's drive toward the Saar and Montgomery's ambitious plan to leapfrog into Germany. Just like that, the momentum of the Allied advance began to sputter as political necessity took precedence over tactical opportunity. Montgomery used his considerable influence and the prestige of the British Empire to convince Eisenhower that his plan, codenamed Operation Market Garden, was the silver bullet that would end the conflict before the first snow fell. He promised a daring airborne assault to capture a series of bridges in the Netherlands, allowing his armored columns to bypass the formidable Siegfried Line. Patton was livid, watching his tanks grind to a halt in the mud of Lorraine because his fuel trucks had been diverted to support a plan he considered fundamentally flawed. The tragedy of Market Garden began with a failure to respect the enemy's ability to recover from defeat, as the Allied intelligence units ignored reports of elite SS Panzer divisions refitting exactly where the paratroopers were scheduled to land. Suddenly, thousands of young men from the 81st and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped into a hornet's nest, and the methodical advance of the British 30th Corps found itself trapped on a single, narrow highway. The ambition of one man had created a bottleneck of death, and as the bridges at Arnhem remained out of reach, the dream of a quick victory vanished in the smoke of burning Sherman tanks. Montgomery's failure did more than just cost lives. It gave the German Wehrmacht a desperately needed breathing room to reorganize and rearm. While the Allies licked their wounds and argued over who was to blame for the disaster in Holland, Adolf Hitler was already looking at a map of the Ardennes forest. Hitler recognized that the Allied coalition was straining under the weight of its own success, and he believed a sudden, violent strike could drive a wedge between the Americans and the British. He envisioned a counteroffensive so massive that it would capture the port of Antwerp, cutting off the Allied supply lines and forcing a negotiated peace. This operation, shrouded in absolute secrecy and titled Watch on the Rhine, required the Germans to move hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tanks into position without being detected by Allied aerial reconnaissance. They moved only at night, using the thick canopy of the Ardennes and the deteriorating winter weather to hide their tracks from the eyes in the sky. Meanwhile, the American commanders in the Ardennes sector viewed the forest as a quiet zone, a place to send exhausted divisions to rest or to blood new, inexperienced troops who had never seen combat. General Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower remained focused on their own offensive plans, convinced that the Germans were too depleted to mount any significant resistance. This intelligence failure was born of a dangerous mixture of overconfidence and a lack of imagination, as the Allies assumed the enemy would behave according to their own logical expectations. But war is rarely logical, and as the temperature began to plummet in mid-December, the silence of the Ardennes became a precursor to a symphony of destruction. American soldiers shivered in their foxholes, many of them lacking proper winter gear because the logistical priority was still being given to offensive munitions rather than defensive survival. They had no idea that 60 miles away, the engines of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies were roaring to life, fueled by the last reserves of the Third Reich. Exactly at 5:30 in the morning, on December 16, 1944, the horizon ignited as over 2,000 German artillery pieces began a massive bombardment along an 85-mile front. The quiet zone was instantly transformed into a landscape of fire and splintering timber, and the sheer weight of the German assault sent the thin American lines into a state of total confusion. Communication wires were severed, command posts were overrun, and the legendary Ghost Front was suddenly teeming with elite German grenadiers and King Tiger tanks. The Americans were caught completely off guard, struggling to understand if this was a local raid or a full-scale invasion. But the reports of massive tank formations moving through the fog soon painted a terrifying picture. Immediately, the German strategy of blitzkrieg was reborn in the snow, and the Allied High Command in Versailles was slow to realize the scale of the catastrophe unfolding to their east. Panic rippled through the rear echelons as rumors of German commandos dressed in American uniforms, spreading misinformation, began to circulate, creating a climate of distrust and paranoia. These saboteurs, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, changed road signs and cut telephone lines, adding a psychological layer to the physical onslaught. But while the perimeter was crumbling, small pockets of American soldiers showed incredible grit, refusing to retreat and forcing the German columns to waste precious time reducing minor obstacles. At the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, the situation was becoming critical as the German advance threatened to encircle the junction that controlled the entire region's road network. If Bastogne fell, the road to the Meuse River would be wide open, and Hitler's gamble might actually succeed in tearing the Allied front asunder. Eisenhower finally grasped the magnitude of the threat on December 17th, realizing that the bulge in his line was expanding at a rate that could lead to total collapse. He called for an emergency meeting at Verdun, bringing together his top commanders to find a way to stop the bleeding before the Germans reached the open country. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the scent of cigars and the palpable tension of men who knew they were staring at a historic defeat. Montgomery remained distant, viewing the crisis as proof that his northern strategy should have been followed all along, while Bradley was visibly shaken by the destruction of his frontline units. It was in this moment of despair that George Patton stood up, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the dim light, and made a claim that everyone in the room thought was the talk of a madman. Eisenhower asked how long it would take for Patton to turn his Third Army 90 degrees and counterattack the German flank to relieve the pressure on the Ardennes. Patton looked at his watch and calmly stated that he could begin the attack with 3 full divisions in only 48 hours. The room fell silent as the other generals exchanged skeptical glances, knowing that moving over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles across icy roads in the middle of a battle was a logistical impossibility. They did not realize that Patton had already anticipated the crisis and had ordered his staff to begin preparing the movement orders days before the meeting even began. This was the turning point where the war of egos ended and the war of survival began, as the fate of the Western Front now rested on the speed of Patton's iron will. While Patton prepared his impossible turn, the men of the 101st Airborne Division were being rushed to Bastogne in open-top trucks, arriving just as the German Iron Ring was closing around the town. They lacked cold-weather boots, sufficient ammunition, and medical supplies, yet they were ordered to hold the crossroads at all costs against an overwhelming force of panzers. The siege of Bastogne would become the defining struggle of the winter, a test of human endurance against the relentless mechanical power of the German army and the unforgiving cruelty of the European winter. Inside the perimeter, General Anthony McAuliffe commanded a patchwork force of paratroopers and remnants of decimated armored units, all of them praying for a miracle or a break in the weather. The German commanders, frustrated by the stubborn resistance at Bastogne, sent a formal demand for surrender, citing the hopelessness of the American position. McAuliffe's response was a single word that would echo through military history: nuts! This defiance galvanized his men, but bravery alone could not stop the shells or the frostbite that was claiming more victims than the enemy's bullets. The clouds remained low and heavy, preventing the Allied air forces from dropping supplies or strafing the German columns, leaving the defenders of Bastogne isolated in a white hell. Every hour they held was an hour Patton used to fuel his frantic drive northward, his engineers working through the night to clear paths through the snow and ice. The logistical feat Patton was attempting was unprecedented, as he had to disengage from a fierce battle in the south, rotate his entire army, and march over 100 miles into a new combat zone without losing momentum. Thousands of trucks moved in a continuous loop, their headlights dimmed to avoid detection, while tank crews fought to keep their engines from freezing solid. Patton was everywhere, cursing, cajoling, and inspiring his men to do what everyone said could not be done, driven by a belief that he was destined for this exact moment of glory. He knew that if he arrived too late, the 101st would be annihilated, and the German breakthrough would become a permanent rupture in the Allied cause. In the north, Montgomery's reaction to the crisis was to take command of the American units cut off from Bradley's headquarters, a move that he handled with a lack of tact that nearly shattered the Anglo-American alliance. He acted as if he were the savior of the Americans, further infuriating Patton and Bradley and creating a toxic environment at the very top of the command structure. But while the generals bickered in their heated chateaus, the common soldiers in the Ardennes were engaged in a savage, primitive form of warfare, fighting from foxhole to foxhole in visibility that rarely exceeded 50 yards. The German momentum was beginning to slow as they ran into twin problems of fuel shortages and the fanatical refusal of American units to yield the ground. The forest was a graveyard of abandoned equipment and frozen corpses, a testament to the high price of Hitler's last gamble and the Allied failure to see it coming. As December 21st arrived, the situation at Bastogne reached its absolute breaking point, with German panzers launching a coordinated assault from multiple directions to finally crush the pocket. The American lines held by a thread, their artillery firing their last remaining rounds, while the wounded lay in makeshift hospitals without heat or anesthesia. The world held its breath, waiting to see if the American blood and guts general could actually perform the miracle he had promised Eisenhower at Verdun. Suddenly, the weather, which had been the Germans' greatest ally, began to show signs of shifting as a high-pressure system moved in from the east, promising clear skies for the first time in weeks. Patton, never one to miss a spiritual opportunity, famously ordered his chaplain to write a prayer asking for good weather for the battle ahead. Whether by divine intervention or meteorological luck, the fog began to lift, revealing a world of blinding white snow and the terrifying sight of the German 5th Panzer Army arrayed for the kill. The stage was set for the most dramatic intervention of the war, as the roar of Patton's Third Army engines finally began to be heard through the frozen woods south of Bastogne. The lifting of the shroud over the Ardennes on December 23rd did more than just reveal the landscape. It signaled the beginning of the end for Hitler's desperate gamble, as the Allied air forces, grounded for days, finally roared into the sky to rain destruction on the exposed German columns. Just like that, the snow-covered roads became corridors of fire, and the German panzers, already struggling with critical fuel shortages, found themselves hunted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts that turned the Ardennes into a graveyard of Krupp steel. But in the foxholes of Bastogne, the clearing sky was a double-edged sword because it meant the German Luftwaffe could also take flight. And that night, the besieged town suffered a brutal aerial bombardment that leveled what few buildings remained standing. Immediately, the pressure on General Anthony McAuliffe intensified as his perimeter shrank under the weight of renewed German assaults from the 5th Panzer Army, whose commanders knew they had a very narrow window to crush the resistance before Patton arrived. Patton's Third Army was not just a collection of soldiers, but a massive, synchronized engine of war that was now performing a logistical feat that defied every rule in the military textbook. Over 100,000 men were moving through a narrow corridor on roads that were more ice than pavement, and yet the momentum never faltered because Patton himself was often at the crossroads, screaming at stalled drivers and personally directing traffic to ensure the flow of steel never stopped. He was obsessed with the relief of Bastogne, seeing it not only as a strategic necessity, but as a personal crusade to prove the superiority of his mobile warfare over the static, cautious methods favored by his rivals in the north. The 4th Armored Division led the charge, their Shermans fitted with duckbill extensions on their tracks to find traction in the deep snow, and they smashed through the German blocking positions with a ferocity that caught the exhausted Wehrmacht defenders off guard. Suddenly, the narrative of the battle shifted from a story of American survival to one of German entrapment, as the Bulge began to look more like a pocket that Patton was preparing to stitch shut. But the German resistance was far from over, and in the small villages like Malmedy and Stavelo, the retreating SS units left behind a trail of atrocities that galvanized the American resolve to a point of cold, calculated fury. The news of the Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were gunned down in a field by Kampfgruppe Peiper, spread through the ranks like wildfire, and Patton used this anger to fuel his men's advance. There was no more talk of Christmas at home, only the grim reality of a war that had become deeply personal, fought in a landscape where the cold was as lethal as the snipers hiding in the tree lines. On December 26th at precisely 4:50 in the afternoon, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command B finally broke through the German lines and made contact with the defenders of the 101st Airborne. The relief of Bastogne was a moment of pure cinematic triumph, but the reality on the ground was far more somber as the rescuers looked into the hollow eyes of men who had been living on frozen rations and willpower for over a week. Patton did not stop to celebrate because he knew the German army was still a dangerous, wounded beast, and he immediately ordered his forces to expand the corridor and begin a general offensive to roll back the German gains. Just like that, the hunter had become the hunted, and the German high command realized that their dream of Antwerp had vanished, replaced by the terrifying prospect of their best divisions being cut off and destroyed in the very woods they had used for cover. While Patton was winning the war on the ground, Field Marshal Montgomery was preparing to win the war of words, a decision that would nearly destroy the fragile unity of the Allied command. Montgomery requested a press conference on January 7, 1945, where he portrayed himself as the savior who had stepped in to rescue the uncoordinated American armies from their own incompetence. He spoke with a condescending tone that implied the Americans had been on the verge of total collapse until he arrived to tidy up the battlefield, ignoring the fact that it was American blood and Patton's impossible turn that had actually broken the German back. This arrogance was the ultimate expression of the ego that had led to the failure of Market Garden, and when Patton heard the reports of the conference, his rage was so profound that he threatened to resign rather than serve another day under the shadow of the British Field Marshal. Eisenhower was caught in the middle of a diplomatic firestorm, knowing that he needed Montgomery's professional skill, but also realizing that Patton's aggressive spirit was the only thing that would end the war quickly. The friction between the commanders reflected the deeper tensions of a coalition where national pride often collided with military necessity, and the Ardennes became the stage for a final showdown between two very different philosophies of command. Patton believed in the war of motion, where speed and violence of action were the keys to minimizing casualties, while Montgomery remained wedded to the set-piece battle, which prioritized meticulous planning over rapid exploitation. The consequence of Montgomery's ego was a permanent rift in the Allied leadership, ensuring that for the remainder of the war, the Americans would operate with an increasing sense of independence from their British counterparts. As January 1945 progressed, the Battle of the Bulge turned into a slow, grinding slaughter as the Allies pushed from the north and south to flatten the salient. The weather remained atrocious, with temperatures dropping so low that oil froze in the guns and men lost limbs to gangrene without ever being hit by a bullet. Patton's Third Army continued to lead the way, crossing the Sauer River in a daring nighttime assault that bypassed the German fortifications and forced a general retreat toward the West Wall. Every mile gained was a testament to the endurance of the American infantrymen, who had transitioned from the shock of the initial invasion to a relentless, methodical counteroffensive that left the German army shattered and unable to defend the borders of the Reich. The German collapse in the Ardennes was total, costing them over 100,000 casualties and, more importantly, the loss of their last armored reserves and fuel stocks. Hitler's Watch on the Rhine had succeeded only in burning through the resources that might have defended Berlin for another year, and the strategic initiative was now permanently in Allied hands. But for George Patton, the victory was bittersweet because he realized that the war he loved was coming to an end, and he looked toward the future with a sense of mounting dread. He began to speak openly about the need to continue the fight against the Soviet Union, whom he viewed as the next great threat to Western civilization, a stance that made the political leadership in Washington increasingly uncomfortable. Immediately after the crossing of the Rhine, Patton's army became a ghost, moving so fast that even the Allied high command lost track of his positions as he raced toward Czechoslovakia and Austria. He was a man possessed, driven by the need to secure as much territory as possible before the Iron Curtain descended, but his outspoken nature and his refusal to play the role of a diplomat eventually led to his downfall. Eisenhower, pressured by the need to maintain a peaceful relationship with Stalin, eventually relieved Patton of his command of the Third Army, a move that broke the spirit of the man who had lived for the battlefield. Just like that, the greatest combat general the United States had ever produced was sidelined, relegated to a desk job overseeing the administration of occupied Bavaria. The tragedy of Patton's end came not on the battlefield, but on a quiet road in Mannheim on December 9, 1945, just as he was preparing to return home to the United States. A freak, low-speed collision with a truck left him paralyzed from the neck down, an ironic and cruel fate for a man who had survived the most intense tank battles in history. He lingered in the hospital for 12 days, his mind sharp but his body a prison, before finally passing away from a pulmonary embolism. His death marked the end of an era, and he was buried, according to his wishes, in the American cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, alongside the men of the Third Army who had fallen during the Battle of the Bulge. But the shadow of Patton's impossible turn and the failure of Montgomery's market garden remained, serving as a permanent lesson in the cost of leadership decisions. History judges Montgomery harshly for his lack of flexibility and his inability to admit fault, while Patton is remembered as the flawed but brilliant visionary who understood the fundamental truth of modern war, that momentum is the only thing that can overcome chaos. The Ardennes was not just a battle of tanks and infantry, but a battle of wills, where the psychological resilience of the American soldier and the decisive action of their commanders prevented a catastrophe that could have extended the war by years. The decision point at Verdun, where Patton promised the 48-hour turn, remains the most studied moment of leadership in the history of the Western Front. It highlights the difference between a commander who manages a war and a leader who masters it, showing that the ability to pivot under pressure is the ultimate military virtue. If Patton had failed, or if Eisenhower had listened to the more cautious voices in his staff, Bastogne would have fallen, and the German army might have reached the Meuse, creating a stalemate that would have changed the post-war map of Europe. Instead, the Allied victory in the Ardennes broke the back of the Nazi regime, opening the door to the final heart of Germany and the eventual liberation of the concentration camps. Today, the Ardennes forest is quiet once again, its scars covered by decades of new growth, but the monuments to the men who fought there serve as a reminder of the thin line between victory and defeat. The Bulge was the last time the German army held the initiative, and their failure there was a direct result of underestimating the speed and resolve of an American army that had finally found its footing. Patton's legacy is not just in the miles of territory he captured, but in the spirit of offensive warfare that he instilled in his troops, a spirit that redefined the American way of war for the 20th century. In the end, the story of 1944 is a story of two men and two philosophies, one that sought glory through meticulous control and failed, and one that found glory through daring flexibility and succeeded. Montgomery's Arnhem and Patton's Bastogne are the two poles of the Allied experience in Europe, representing the danger of hubris and the power of decisive leadership. As we look back through the lens of history, we see that the most important weapon on any battlefield is not the tank or the airplane, but the mind of the commander who refuses to believe in the word impossible. The legacy of the Second World War is written in the blood of those who held the line when all seemed lost and those who charged forward when the world told them to wait. George Patton was many things, arrogant, profane, and controversial. But in the winter of 1944, he was exactly what the world needed to stop the darkness from closing in. His life ended in a hospital bed, but his spirit remains on the roads of the Ardennes, moving at the speed of heat, forever chasing the next horizon. Given the choice between Montgomery's methodical planning and Patton's aggressive intuition, which leadership style do you believe is more effective in a modern crisis? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.